Brian. Welcome back. Another episode in our James Hardie ColorPlus video series.
Thank you. Glad
Appreciate
to be
you
here.
being here, buddy. This one's been on my mind a lot because I know there's different pieces that you'll touch on, but just the evolving, ever evolving it feels like, but the latest best practice for installing James Hardie ColorPlus products. And I know some of this will probably cross over just into primed or brand X fiber cement plank too. So maybe the place we could start first is just proper storage. I know we've done episodes on plywood series and things like that, and things go out, they get on a jump site, they're laying in a mud puddle and so forth. So I'm assuming there's a story from James Hardie on proper storage as well.
There is. For us, it's pretty straightforward. We want dry and flat, right? So ideally, we want a place where it's dry. So we don't want it in mud puddles. We don't want it to be sitting, on a steep angle. We want it to be sort of flat and clean and accessible. We do ship, if you're buying a full unit of product, we do ship it with a shipping bag. So there's a bag that covers the material. That's really intended to protect it during shipping. It's not a long-term storage vessel. So if you do have product and it's coming to the site and you're not going to be using it for a period of time and it's wet and rainy or something, then we would recommend that you tarp it or cover it. Ideally, the product is going to be dry when you're using it and making its way to the wall then.
Gotcha. Say it was unbagged on the site and got rained on for 3 straight days.
Sure.
Is there a protocol that you need to have a moisture meter before you throw paint on that, or is there any advice in that?
Yeah,
in that situation?
I would say, and we see that, right? I mean, it happens, right? And it's construction, right? So sometimes somebody forgets to tarp it and it gets wet overnight. So our preference would be if you can put it in a garage, if you can put it in a space.
Sticker it maybe, stick it with some airflow.
Absolutely, let it dry out. The back of our product is not finished, so it allows moisture to exit as needed.
Okay.
And so our recommendation would be, if you've got a whole pallet, typically what we see if it gets wet is the top courses are all wet. You pull those courses, put them in a garage, let them dry out. Easiest way to tell is if you look at the back, you can sort of tell how much moisture content is there. No need for moisture testing, just make sure it's relatively dry when you're putting it back up. That would be sort of the normal protocol.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Butt joints and cut ends. I don't know if the story is different for prime versus color, but we could touch on those 2 areas.
I think there's a little bit of difference in order of procedure, but not a big difference in sort of our requirements. And we've made a pretty concerted effort, because the consumer wants low maintenance, to how do we get to as many opportunities to make it low maintenance. And one of the things that if you would look back in the years, right, especially if it was wood cladding, you would have seen a lot of caulking at butt joints. And our recommendation in primed is we do not recommend that you caulk any of the butt joints. We recommend moderate contact. That means the 2 boards touching, and then we recommend something behind the boards. We call it back flashing, which basically any moisture that makes its way through that butt joint is going to hit that plastic, metal, slip sheet and make its way out of the wall cavity, right? Gotcha. So that sort of moderate contact would be our course for either primed or color. Okay. On color, we have taken that extra step and said it is not allowed. So we do not allow for caulking at that butt joint. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the paint, has nothing to do with the ability for the product to operate. It really is 100% around maintenance. We do not want the consumer to have to deal with more maintenance if it's at all possible. And we know that that butt joint, if it's caulked, the caulking will need to be replaced or recaulked at some point. That's going to minimize that longevity of an exterior cladding. So we really are strongly opposed to, we do not want to see at butt joints any caulking. You would still caulk what we call the terminal ends, so where the siding would truncate into trim, so you're going from a horizontal to a vertical piece.
Or the edge of a window
or the edge of a window.
Or something.
So for sure we would have caulking there because there's different thermal movements horizontally and vertically, but we would not want, in the field, we would not want any caulking.
Okay.
Now on color, our recommendation would be, and we provide touch-up kits that come with the product, that you would actually paint that end before you make your way to the wall.
Okay.
Whereas if it's prime, you could have it on the wall and potentially you could prime it when it's on the wall. But with paint, it's much easier if you're notching around a window or you're cutting, you have a cut end, we'd want to see that painted prior to making its way to the wall. The thinking that we always have and we communicate with anyone doing the install is you're the last line of defense. There's nobody circling behind you with the spray gun to clean up your hidden issues.
Yeah.
You need to make sure that when that board goes on the wall, you take a second, you make sure that it looks good and all the 5 sides, meaning everything but the back, is painted and finished, and then you're good to move on.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. It seems like on the color especially, just doing your homework and having a game plan is huge.
Yeah. A little bit of forethought, right, and making sure that you're prepared does make that process go a little simpler. There's not a tremendous amount of differences, but there's a few critical pieces, and that, again, painting before it hits the wall, it makes all the difference. It makes it easier.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a great tip. When it comes to fasteners, could you talk about the concept of blind nailing? And then I think in your installation guide, the term you guys used was pinbacks.
Yeah, so most of the time what we see in our installation, and it's mainly with lap, which is the most dominant product that we see, is that we're basically nailing on the top of the board. It's about 1 inch down from the top of the board because the 2 boards overlap 1.25 inches. And so the advantage there is when you put that nail in, the other board's gonna hide it and you don't see it. And that 1 inch is sort of it's a critical dimension. And the reason we say that is if you nail too high and you're in an area where there's more wind, that you might get some rattling on the wall. If you nail too low, same thing. So we know that 1 inch line hides the fastener, blind nails, so you don't see it. And especially with pre-finished products, now you don't have to worry about touching it up. If you run into a situation where, let's say you have strapping that would be sort of to help maintain your shear value, right? So the building doesn't shift. That may cause some bending of the product. And there may be areas where you may want to have to, basically put a fastener to tuck it flush or flat. Our recommendation would be a 16 gauge finish nail. And so it's what we tell the installers are, you just need to do it where you think it's applicable. We don't want to see a bunch of them. It's not super necessary. The advantage of blind nailing is as the envelope moves and shifts, it allows that board, because it's only fastened at the top, to move as it needs to.
Sure.
So if you start to put a bunch more nails and then need it, and you're holding that product flat to the wall, and the wall, which is made of wood, expands and contracts more heavily, it can cause issues with the wall assembly or with the cladding. So our recommendation is blind nails, 1 inch down, and pinbacks where needed with a smaller headed finish nail, 16 gauge.
That makes sense. It sounded like there are certain scenarios where face nailing is required to maintain a warranty. Could you talk about situations?
Yeah, we don't see a ton of them in, we'll say, the Pacific Northwest. There are some areas that do, and it's really driven off of usually wind speed. So the average wind speed that we see is basically an 85 mile or less wind speed, which would require just a blind nail application. If you're in a unique space, like we'll say the top of a mountaintop, or you're sitting right on the edge of the ocean where, again, you have a unique wind pattern, it would be good to just make sure that you understand what is the average wind speed within that area. If you do exceed that 85, then you may have areas where you need to add what would be a face nail as well. I don't see it very often, but every once in a while there's an application where, again, it's right on the water or it's right on the top of a mountain and there's a unique wind pattern, but usually you can get away with blind nail. We have a report, we call it the NER 405. I know that's a mouthful. It's basically an engineering background report that shows different application instructions. So if you are attaching to metal studs, if you're trying to go over CMU block, if you have a unique situation, it provides other fastener options. But I would say the majority of what we see is a standard 2 inch siding nail, blind nailed 1 inch down.
Okay. If I read it right, it looked like to avoid face nailing, you actually had to go into the stud. If you were just going into your CDX or your OSB, when push comes to shove, if there's a challenge, your warranty would be void.
Yeah, I mean, our testing shows that we need that embedment into wood. And so while you may have CDX or you may have some type of sheathing material, that material typically is less than 1 inch. And ideally, we want 1 inch into a wood structure because that's going to hold onto that shank of that nail and keep the product on the wall. So, yeah.
That makes sense. I think in talking to our friends at the Western Red Cedar Lumber Association, I'm pretty sure that's their best practices too for nailing up cladding.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not getting in the stud. I know this is one that's evolved over the years. It's just different ways to cut the product, and I guess what I would term modifying. You know, I don't know if it can be routed or shaved or whatever, but you just sort of talk about best practices to do those things, or if there's some things you flat out don't recommend too.
Yeah, so I would say there's more of those probably no's that we don't like to see. And again, we're trying to keep people safe and we're trying to make the board perform. So we'll talk a little bit about those as well. But I think our cutting practice is, I'd say, relatively straightforward. What we typically see is someone using a skill saw, you know, a handheld saw. That is the most common. Now there are other options, snapper shears, the shears that basically would, again, create sort of a clean, crisp separation of the product. But we typically see is someone using a saw. And our best practice and our studies have shown what you don't want to do with fiber cement is grind it. That is the worst thing you can do. The best thing you can do is to basically chip away at the product. So if you think about a Hardie blade, and so we partnered with some different manufacturers, and we have a product called the Hardie blade. And what it is, it's a 4-tooth blade. And what it does, unlike a traditional saw blade, which has 16 or 20 or 30 some teeth, right? What it's doing is it's chipping away and taking bigger chunks out of the product. That still creates a clean edge, so you don't see a ragged edge to it, but it creates a clean edge where it's taking larger chunks out of the board. And that is sort of what we see every day. Now, we'd also recommend that saw is connected to a vacuum setup, because again, anytime we can manage any type of dust in the air, that's always a better practice. And so what we would really like to see is we'd like to see someone using a 7¼ inch saw blade, preferably a Hardie blade, because again, we know it's only got 4 teeth or similar, connected to a standard utility vacuum setup. It doesn't have to be a super crazy expensive one, but just connecting it to your normal utility vac, that'll help absorb any dust in the air as well.
Okay. So the R&R pros in the area, they're basically using a battery-powered circular saw.
Yeah.
They're not chopping it or shearing it.
Yeah, most of them are using a saw setup, and again, the advancements have come a long way. So I see a lot more guys using battery power tools and connected to a saw, a vacuum rather, to collect the dust.
Okay. One of the topics I was really glad that we could include here is just the best practices around caulking. I know there's been some lessons learned along the path that we've all traveled. So maybe you could share where we've landed with that.
There's a number of manufacturers that have now color matched our products. So we partnered early on with Quad OSI, and Quad has color matched our products, but there's other products out there in the market that you can buy that are color matched, that literally will match our Arctic white or our Boothbay blue, so they match our color palette exactly. The critical key, I think, with tinted, or we'll call it colored caulk, is to make sure that you don't tool it. Now, most caulk manufacturers say not to tool the product, yet we see every day, people sort of smearing or tooling, dragging that caulking. The reason you don't want to do that with a pre-finished product is because with a pre-finished product, what's happening is you have the pigment of that color inside of the caulk. And as you thin the bead of that caulk, what happens is the UV can break it down faster. And what I've seen in areas where people have used caulking as touch-up, they've taken small little dabs of caulking, like let's say it's blue caulking on blue siding, and touched up a nail head here or there, or touched up a small scratch. If it's super thin, the UV will break down that pigment and that color will disappear. And now instead of blue caulk, you have white caulk on a blue wall.
Wow.
So we would very strongly recommend that you're reading the caulking manufacturer's expectations. But there are a number of options out in the market where if you're buying Boothbay blue, you can get a Boothbay blue color that will basically match that similar color.
And since it sounds like you sort of have one shot, so you probably should do some practicing if you've never caulked before.
Yes.
So you can lay out a relatively smooth bead.
Yes.
Because you don't want to mess with it.
We learned that, surprisingly, out of all of the differences between a prime to color installation, the one item that we have spent a lot of time training on is caulking. Yeah. And that's strictly because you're right. Most siders or most installers would not have to worry much about the finished aesthetic of the caulking, because again, it's ultimately going to get painted over and they can tool and smudge it and smear it.
Yeah.
So that has been a really big learning for us, and we partnered with with our caulk manufacturer here locally, and we've done extensive testing and training where we've shown guys and taught guys how to actually caulk appropriately.
Yeah.
But you're right, practice makes perfect. It's not something that anyone's going to just pick up off the shelf, put it in the caulk gun, and go out and do a great job. It takes a little bit of time to master that skill.
Okay. Touch-up, you've mentioned that a time or two. You have a scratch, you have a pin back, you, for whatever reason, you had to face nail in a few areas. Blemish. How do you do that, and how good a match is that these days?
Yeah, it is not exactly the same. While it's the same paint, remember, one of the things that we are doing on ColorPlus is we're heating the board and we're heating the paint. So now in the field, you can't replicate that same heating element. So we strongly advise, we say no paint on paint. And I know that seems a little counterintuitive, right? If I'm gonna paint my interior wall, I'm gonna put multiple coats, and what I'm trying to do is get paint on paint. But because it's not exactly the same environment and it's not exactly the same temperature, our recommendation is use the touch-up to cover nail heads, to cover any areas where there's a scuff on the board that, again, you're touching up the paint onto the substrate. You're not just applying willy-nilly over top of it. So we don't want to see, somebody taking a paintbrush and trying to, paint over an entire board and thinking that board's going to look exactly the same. It's really, the key is touching up where necessary and keeping paint off paint. One of the other tips that we've learned over the years is the person who's basically installing, they don't normally have a rag. We've given guys rags and we said, listen, after you touch up, take a rag and wipe it. Because if you've scuffed the substrate, if there's a scratch on the board and you put a little bit of paint on it, it'll inherently bond to that substrate. And if you take a rag and wipe it, you won't wipe off the paint, you'll wipe off any excess paint that's trying to bond to the surface.
Interesting.
So we've really, it's just little things like you should have a rag, and after you touch up, just take a wipe coat over. That way you'll minimize, if you did over paint or you have too much paint on paint, you'll wipe that paint right off.
Just a clean rag of some sort.
Yep, clean rag.
Okay.
Yep.
Did I see in there somewhere there was a recommendation if you're touching up something bigger than a dime that you should consider replacing the piece? How serious are you about that?
Yeah, again, we want to make sure that we're maintaining that long-term solution for the consumer, right? So the person who's living in that home, the person that is spending the time and the energy to make this decision, that they're getting that long-standing aesthetic. So yeah, we're very clear on, when you're installing or as the product's going, you have to make sure that you're maintaining, you're keeping an eye on it. Yeah. You can't just assume, I'll come back later and worry about a scuff or a scratch. Our recommendation is touch up as you go and make sure once that board's on the wall that it looks good. And if you see any major blemishes or inconsistencies, now's the time. It is much easier to pull one board off at that moment, pull out those nails, put a new board on, than have to come back later. And I've seen situations where, maybe somebody who hasn't experienced it, hasn't gone through that process, didn't attend to some of those issues, they end up maybe having to paint an entire wall because they have a bunch of touch-up that they, larger scuffed areas they try to fix later, and it just doesn't look as consistent and as clean, and then they've got to go back and repaint everything. So we really strongly say, take an extra, 20 seconds when the board's on the wall, go back and forth, take a look, any concerns or issues, go to the next one.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
In going through these episodes with you, I find myself wondering, as far as the recommendation of a homeowner doing it themselves. My kids and I had worked on a project for a few years, and they sided the whole house with ColorPlus and seemed to go pretty well, but I'm assuming there might be some additional advice if somebody's considering that. And that's why we're creating this series, for people to evaluate, say,
sure,
yeah, I could do that, or I'm way over my skis here. So maybe you could share a little bit of what your recommendations are.
I definitely think that there is there's a group out there, there's the DIYers out there that are pretty savvy, and that could definitely do this type of project. I think, just from sort of, materials through installation, materials are available, right? We have product that's in the market, and if somebody needs, product, we have it available. So in terms of access to product, it's pretty available. Then I start thinking about, what tools do I need? And I think a lot of DIYers have a skill saw. So really you're talking about the purchasing of a blade. You're talking about maybe a coil nailer, right? A siding nailer. I've seen people rent them before. If you're, again, thinking I'm only going to side once and I don't really need to invest in a full nailer that I'm going to keep, but getting access to the tools is a pretty small hurdle. For us, we're sensitive to sort of during that installation, two major pieces. The first would be making sure you understand the installation requirements, right? There's a number of pieces like the gap between the siding and the trim, how to manage and maintain an accurate butt joint, where to nail, when not to nail, those types of things. So I would strongly encourage anyone who's interested in doing that to make sure that they're up to speed with our installation guidelines. We publish a installation by product type. So you can go to our online references and you could see there's 2 or 3 pages that help with sort of design. So if you're trying to figure out how to design with that product.
Oh, nice.
And then there's 2 or 3 pages that literally walk through, this is how you would nail. These are the types of nails that you would use. So it's not like you've got to study an encyclopedia to be an expert, but spending a little bit of time making sure you understand that. For us at James Hardie, one of the most critical sort of foundations of our business is safety. And I think that's the one piece that I would just be sort of cognizant of if I was doing a reside myself is, do I have to get on a ladder? And am I doing it safely? Do I need help with a lift, or do I have to rent a lift? A lot of times you'll see pump jacks, which are basically attached to the roof and allow somebody to basically stand on a plank to be able to work on the wall. That, I think, is where we get more sensitive because we want to make sure that people are being safe. Yeah. The last thing we want is somebody decides they're going to go out and try to reside their home and they get hurt, whether it's using the tools improperly or working in a space that's way too high for the ladder they're working on.
Gotcha.
So that's an area that I don't think people think about as much, but when they're undertaking a new task, it's a critical piece of we want those people to be safe. And so that's a piece that I think may be a little bit more challenging or isn't thought about as frequently by the DIYer.
Right,
So,
not on the radar.
yeah, but it's possible. For sure it's possible, and we've seen it. We just want to make sure that they understand the installation and that they're being safe as they're applying, working with the tool safely, and obviously working at elevations safely.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up safety. It just came to mind, masks, respirators. When you're cutting the product, you recommend like an N95 or throw on a respirator while you're using the saw, or is there anything you share there? That
we really don't. We say if you're using a 7 1/4 inch, again, blade that's identified for fiber cement, typically 4 tooth, and you're connecting it to a vacuum, you're good to go.
You're just not going to have that much up around your head. Okay, great. One thing you and I have talked about over the years, and it's become a bigger and bigger deal with respect to building science and building smart, is rain screens. And there's all kinds of animals, and you've got plank, and you've got shingle, and you've got panel, you got primed color. Want to just touch on that a little bit? I know we could do a whole new episode on that, but just kind of how maybe some of these installation requirements change depending on the rain screen setup you've got going on.
Yeah, I would say that generally speaking, a rain screen is the idea of creating space. It's that idea of space between the back of the cladding, in this case, our siding, let's say, and the wall itself. So it's an air space, and what that does is it allows moisture to fall out of that cavity to exit the wall if it needs to. If it's drying, meaning it's starting to warm up and there's moisture in the wall cavity, it can become moisture and vapor and go up. It allows the ability for the product, the wall, the cladding, everything to basically drain and dry appropriately. And I would say, generally speaking, from a building science standpoint, we're 100% behind the idea of a rain screen. So we would recommend rain screens. We think it makes a ton of sense. I think when you think about the Seattle market and where we're at here, we're in a unique space in that if you go to Vancouver, BC, every structure requires a rain screen.
Wow.
It's a requirement in Vancouver.
Commercial or residential?
Doesn't matter.
Period.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter what the cladding is. Anything you're building in BC requires a rain screen. When you go to see our friends down in Portland, they have a specific requirement that is more robust, that creates a denser, heavier, thicker space. And that's a requirement in Oregon.
Yeah.
Here, we don't have that requirement. So it's a little bit unique that we're sort of sandwiched between, but there's no question as we think about the building science, having that air gap, the draining and drying makes sense. With that being said, we typically don't see it a lot on our lap products. So you think about traditional lap. One of the advantages is when the two products overlap, it automatically creates a small gap between the two pieces. And so that does allow for some draining and drying. When you get into products like panels, so you think about board and batten, big panels with trim details on top, that's where, again, having that space to drain and dry makes more sense.
Gotcha.
So we don't require it. We default to whatever the construction type is. So if you're building a residential home and you fall under International Building Code for residential in Seattle, you would adhere to whatever that requirement is.
Gotcha.
So in BC, they're putting on a rain screen because the government says that's a requirement. The jurisdiction says that. And the same thing in Portland, right? For an enhanced WRB, that's a requirement there. What we're making sure people understand is we 100% believe draining and drying holistically for the wall assembly makes a ton of sense. And so we'd recommend it, but it's not a requirement.
Yeah.
I see it more in panel applications because of that flatness and having very little ability to dry. In lap applications, we don't see it very often, especially in a residential home. It going direct to what we call direct to sheathing, right over top of the weather barrier is the most typical solution.
It seems like as the assembly is getting more complicated and you're building it up, you're adding the furring strips and so forth, you have to really keep track of where those studs are, because at the end of the day, you've got to be hitting those studs. And if you start adding continuous exterior insulation and all that, then it looked like you have to factor in the weight of the boards, and it becomes a little bit more of a calculation if you get to that point.
It does. I think ultimately what it comes back to is we've got a requirement of how much sort of embedment in wood. So as you add continuous insulation, there's no holding value for that insulation. So that means you're elongating your fastener. And again, there's limitations on the tools. So if you have a standard siding nailer, that's only going to shoot up to like a 2.5-inch nail. So if you've got a big, thick insulation and you're trying to drive a fastener through, all of a sudden it's like, well, wait, I need a 4-inch nail. So that's where I think the evolution of the rain screen really picked up momentum. Because if you attach that furring back to the sheathing and it's back to the stud, now you have continuous wood that makes it easier for our attachments to maintain what I'd consider to be normal tools. You're not having to go and get some unique fastening gun that only works, in that weird application. You're able to use a standard fastening tool. So it does create some more challenges, but there are applications and ways to overcome that. But it really becomes a function of that rain screen sort of helps make it easier for standard fastening applications.
It's been a great episode, man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.